Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure today of talking to Dylan Pahman at the Acton Institute, who is also the editor of their journal and the author of a notable new book called The Kingdom of God and the Common Good, Orthodox Christian Social Thought. Dylan, thank you for joining this conversation.
Good to be here, Mark.
So, starting with the basics, what do you mean by Christian social thought? Do you mean political theology or is it more particular?
Yeah, it's a little more particular. So Christian social thought usually refers to what was called the social question in the 19th century. So the problem of the working poor in the new industrial era. And I mean, technically, Christian social thought has always existed, but as far as modern Christian social thought, so I have in mind more of a Christian perspective on political economy. So not just strictly economics, but how do we apply what we know about our new economic circumstances to our life today, and how do we interact with that in a way that's faithful to our theology?
And how is Eastern Orthodox social thought different from Western Christian social thought or Protestant or Roman Catholic Christian social thought, or is it significantly different?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I actually start the book by surveying other Western traditions because I think there's a lot of false dichotomies out there, so I want to make sure I wasn't doing that. So there is a lot of common ground. Um, there's things like natural law is common across traditions, at least historically, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. And then there's this kind of old, what I call an old social map, a Christian social map, that really till the 19th century was pretty common and useful. And it was the idea that basically society was divided into church, state, and family. You can see this in catechisms in the modern era, again, across denominations, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. When they get to the commandment to honor your father and mother, it will then say, and also the other legitimate authorities, in among which they'll say, the magistrate or the state, and church authorities. And so that was kind of their map of society. But in the 19th century, you do suddenly get something genuinely new. And really starting in the late 18th century, and that is that people go to work, and the people they work for, it's not a state enterprise, it's not the church, and it might not even be a family business. They're just working for somebody else who happens to have started a business. This is a new sphere of social life, and understanding, well, what are the duties of the different people, employers and employees? What are the limitations? What are the restrictions? All those sorts of things become big, 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 big questions, really for everybody in the 19th century, but then especially for Christian pastors and leaders. So that's what we're talking about, and there is a lot of common ground, I think. What makes the Orthodox tradition unique? I have a few different emphases that I talk about, but I think maybe the two most prominent ones, ones that are kind of the easiest to notice and that any Orthodox Christian might be likely to think of, although we're a little under theorized. That's why I wrote this book in the first place. But that would be our liturgical point of view and our ascetic point of view, which I kind of include as part of that. And so that comes down to seeing all of life as part of this relationship with God, who's given us the world in order that we offer it back up to him, right? He gave Adam and Eve the garden, and he told them to eat of every tree except for that one. And of course, we messed up and ate from the wrong tree. But other than that, they were supposed to eat from the trees. They're supposed to enjoy what God gave them. They were supposed to tend and keep the garden, so keep it productive. And that's still, at the heart of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be God's creatures and his image bearers. Another common principle is the idea of the image of God in all people, of course. And then asceticism is kind of the other side of that coin. So he did say, "Do not eat about one tree," right? Well, "do not eat" is to fast. Asceticism is about self-denial. Part of being responsible, really the thing that distinguishes us from the animals is our ability to practice self-restraint, right? That we are not simply slaves to our passions, but we have been given reason. Again, reflecting that image of God. From an Orthodox point of view, asceticism is not a negative thing. It's not that we fast because like the material world is ucky or something like that. That'd be like a Gnostic point of view. Rather, it's just about rightly ordering our desires, remembering that our most important food is God Himself. Right? It's the Eucharist. It's just spiritual food. It's the Word of God, as Deuteronomy says, right? And we don't want anything else to take precedence. And so we do a lot of fasting and other sorts of practices like silence and solitude and those sorts of things, not because we think the things we're abstaining from are bad, but because we want to transform our relationship to them. And when you combine those things together, you see how these have economic implications, right? Economics is all about the prudent management of our scarce resources. And liturgy and asceticism give us this different sort of glasses to view them, to understand not simply how to produce more, but how to produce better, and how to do so in a way that's glorifying to God.
And so, how would this perspective be different from Catholic social thought emerging in the 19th century?
Yeah, good question. So, Roman Catholic social thought, I think there's a lot of common ground in principle, but one thing I actually see kind of glaringly absent, maybe until only very recently, is any emphasis on their own ascetic tradition. They have one. Really, every Christian tradition has some practice of prayer, fasting, almsgiving, all these sorts of typical, we might not like the word asceticism, but that's what they are. They're ascetic disciplines. And of course, Roman Catholicism has that as well. But it's really hard to find mentions of self-denial, self-discipline, all those sorts of things that go along with that perspective. They don't really appear in those like papal social encyclicals. More recently, the reason why I said that's maybe changing is Pope Leo XIV in his recent apostolic exhortation actually had a long discursus on monasticism, and he focuses quite a bit on an ascetic approach to the world. So maybe that'll be changing, but it's something that I find just kind of curiously absent. It's not like they don't have this tradition, but nobody has really done the work of connecting the dots between this as a personal practice and this as something that has social implications. That's what my research over the last 15 years has here at Acton has focused on within my own tradition. That not only am I trying to reorient my relationship with God, but it necessarily has social effects as well. So if I want to have a relationship with another person, I always am doing this in the middle of an interview where I'm being asked to talk, so it's always a bad example. But at some point, I need to stop talking and I need to listen if I want to have a relationship with you, right? That's how a relationship works. I need to practice self-denial, or there's no relationship. It's just me talking. It's a monologue, and so all of these practices, they actually have social implications as well. So that's something that I do think sets apart the Orthodox tradition, not only in terms of the common piety that we still have like Lenten cookbooks and it's something that still happens on a pretty common lay level, but it's also something that you can see even into the late 19th, 20th century. The few Orthodox writers who did try to engage with our modern economies usually tend to get this. They talk about the social implications of asceticism. So I think that's something that the Eastern traditions really have to bring to the conversation.
Now, there's often a caricature in the West of Eastern Orthodoxy that it's hostile to liberty, that it's authoritarian, hostile to the free market.
Yeah.
To what extent is there any truth behind those caricatures?
Well, of course, I mean, church history is not anybody's ideal. I don't care what your perspective is. You're going to find a whole lot of other things if you really read out the details. And the book is divided into 5 parts, and part 3 looks at Orthodox church history. So I give kind of a good, bad, and the ugly. So yes, of course, there is some authoritarian in Eastern Christian history. There is authoritarian in Western Christian history as well. But that's not the whole story in the West, and it's not the whole story in the East. So a few examples I give. To actually stick with the ascetic example, monasteries in the Byzantine Empire were actually neither church nor state. They were usually founded on family estates. So if anything, they kind of grew out of that, third category of social life. But you can find more than one monastic source really defending the rights and independence of these monastic communities, including things like property rights. They had massive estates. These were economic powerhouses in some cases. They produced goods and they traded because they wanted to have something to give. And if you don't do any work and you don't sell anything, you don't have anything extra to give, right? And so you have people like Saint Nicholas Cabasilas, a 14th century Orthodox saint. He was a politician and lawyer before he became a monk, and he wrote a defense of monastic property because the Byzantine state said, they got a lot of land and we're at war with the Persians or whoever, and I think we could manage that a lot better than them, and they wanted to expropriate it. And he said, you can't do that. For one thing, it's a violation of the property rights of the people who, passed on that land to them, often as a matter of inheritance. They would leave it to the monasteries. But also, the monks have a right to their property, whether they use it well or waste it. To the point where he sees these broader social implications. He doesn't even just stop there. He says, how could there ever be a stable form of government which made it impossible to live in freedom? And this is a 14th century Byzantine saint. So we have plenty of resources to draw on. Another one, as far as freedom and democracy goes, that I discovered in the process of writing this book, and I liked it so much I put it on the cover. If you see the cover of the book, it's a painting of medieval Novgorod, and it's a market. Novgorod, for 350 years in the Middle Ages, was a republic. The people voted. It wasn't just the aristocrats. It was any citizen would vote on the laws, would vote on the rulers, and that even included the archbishop. In fact, they were so democratic that they would get it down to the top three candidates, the top three monks, to be the next archbishop of Novgorod, and then they would put lots on the altar of the Cathedral of Saint Sophia, and then they would cast lots to see who wins. So basically, they gave God a vote. Right? They're so democratic. They found a way to let God vote. And so we have a history with that. And that's something that if you think of even, just Russian Orthodox history, which of course is, Orthodoxy is much broader than Russia, but that's part of it. When people think of that, they tend to think of the Russian Empire. And there's good and bad in the Russian Empire too, but that only lasted 200 years. And this republic lasted 350, and it wasn't the only one. There was another city up, Pskov, which was also a republic. And so we have these resources, but we just haven't really had anyone bring them all together. And that's the point of the book, in part, is to show us what we have, to show other people what we have to offer, and then to try to integrate it with insights from modern economics so that whatever someone's vocation may be, especially if they're Orthodox, they can live their Orthodox faith in a way that they can feel is a little more authentic and sure themselves about it, instead of kind of feeling like they got to make it up as they go, or divide Sunday from the other 6 days of the week in their mind. We want to be completely unified in who we are as Christians, and part of that means, well, we have to understand our world today, and we have to understand our own tradition.
Are there differences in the practice of Orthodox social thought in majority Orthodox countries versus Orthodox living in non-Orthodox countries?
Yeah, I would say mostly coming out of just the different polities. So most traditionally Orthodox countries are either places like, the Balkans, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, or Russia or Georgia, where there is an established Orthodox church. Might not be the only church. They might have religious liberty, but just like in England, you have a state church, right? It might be similar to that. And that's going to, of course, affect the way things go. When you have a church tax that's paying for all the church's expenses, that's going to change your perspective on things like tithing, right? But even so, I mean, some years ago, I went to Greece in the middle of the financial crisis, to try to determine what was going on and how was the church helping people who'd fallen on hard times. And I was really happy to discover that churches were doing a lot. They had soup kitchens. They were helping people with job training and connecting them with different resources. So they weren't just kind of waiting around for the state to do it for them. But it still is a different context. And then the other option or the possibility, although in most cases they're not the majority anymore, but in the Middle East, a place like Lebanon is very politically complicated. I think maybe they have a Maronite majority, which would be Catholic, um, but still, they have a large Orthodox population, and at best they're minority in a place with religious liberty, or in a country like um, uh, Syria or something like that, it might be closer to like a dimitude where they have an official second class status. And that's also very different than a Western context. Although, of course, it depends on the Western context. But in the United States, I think we're just so blessed to have a genuine religious liberty here. And it's something that I do chart out in my book a little bit. Is Once again, we have roots in our tradition. This is really universal. Any Christian, the earliest Christians in ancient Rome, when they were being persecuted again and again and again, they said, please treat us like everyone else. You can't coerce conscience. It doesn't make any sense to try to do this when it comes to religion. Let's just have religious liberty. And then when you get the first Christian emperor, what does he do? He doesn't make Christianity the state religion. He declares religious liberty in the Edict of Milan. And so that's something that, again, it didn't continue that way. We had all sorts of twists and turns. I wouldn't try to, color everything with rose-colored glasses or anything like that. But there are real resources, East and West, for um, interacting differently in these different contexts. So when you're in a situation like in Greece, where the majority of people at least identify as Orthodox, and that's kind of the default, and it has some state support, there's a different challenges because it's a different context. I personally am not for establishment, but it is a fact in some cases, and so people living in those contexts need to figure out, okay, how do we best navigate this context. And so it's going to look a little different depending on where you are in the world.
Is there a key turning point for Eastern Orthodoxy similar to the Roman Catholic Church, which officially accepted full religious freedom in the 1960s?
That is a really good question. I don't know that there is. I think it depends a lot on the context. Maybe you could say coming out of the fall of the Soviet Union, I think most majority Orthodox nations have some kind of constitutional guarantee of religious liberty. But I'm not an expert on that. Before that time, they would have probably been, before the Russian Revolution, they've probably been Orthodox kingdoms of some sort, in which case they probably had, not quite a full religious freedom, although they might have been tolerant. So maybe it would just be the 20th century. I don't know exactly, but again, that does depend, at the place and the time. You can see, in like the 11th century, Byzantium's trading with so many different people, they had to be tolerant whether they wanted to or not, right? When they're so dependent upon trade, it actually does change the way you approach questions like that.
And have the American Orthodox communities contributed significantly to Orthodox social thought?
Yeah, so I mentioned Father Alexander Schmemann earlier, his book For the Life of the World. He was, I believe, he had an Estonian background. He spent his younger years in France and Paris, but then he came to the United States, and he's one of the founders of the Orthodox Church in America, which is the Orthodox jurisdictions are complicated, but it's an Orthodox jurisdiction in the United States with Russian roots. And so he's one of the founders of this Orthodox Church in America, and he's one of our most kind of socially aware theologians of that period, I would say. One of the big differences East and West is the massive amount of damage communism did in the Orthodox world. Not, of course, that it didn't do some damage in the Western world as well, such as Poland. But you had people that in the late 19th and early 20th century were asking all the same questions that you find among Western theologians of, what do we do about people being uprooted from, countryside life and going to the big city to try to make a way for themselves and finding themselves in harsh working conditions and on and on and on, all those sorts of questions. They were addressing it. They were, looking into it. And then the revolution happens, and suddenly they're living as exiles in foreign lands, in Western lands, and they have new questions. And those questions are more about, well, how do we maintain faithfulness to our Orthodox tradition while also trying to be, friendly and work with other Western traditions. And and sometimes they go in a polemical direction, sometimes they go in a more irenic kind of ecumenical direction. But that kind of becomes the number one focus, I'd say, by the mid to late 20th century. So you don't really get thinking about these more specific economic issues until a bit more recently.
And if you're meeting a stranger and you had to explain the three or four core principles of Orthodox social thought, succinctly,
Yeah.
what would they be?
All right. So I think the two, well, in addition to asceticism and liturgy, we'll say I already did those. But in addition to those, I think the two most fundamental are an Orthodox perspective on the law and the gospel. So the law aims at justice, right, to render to each what is due. The gospel aims at mercy, to do good even to those who have no claim upon you. So it goes beyond the law. I think understanding the difference between those and being able to sort out in your head what belongs to law and justice and what belongs to and that it should be impartial and personal, and what belongs to personal calling and mercy and context. I think that's really, really helpful in sorting out a lot of social situations. And then the other one is a concept called Catholicity, or in Russian, Sobornost. And we're Orthodox, so it's a little weird that that's our concept, right? But it's not a Roman Catholic concept, although it could be anybody's, because it goes all the way back to Ignatius of Antioch. He was martyred in 110 AD. He knew all the apostles, or at least Peter, and he wrote 7 letters to churches in, I think, mostly Asia Minor, but also Rome, on his way to martyrdom. So he was arrested in Antioch, then brought to Rome, tried, and then executed in the Colosseum by wild animals. And in one of his letters, he writes warning the Smyrnaeans about the Gnostics. The Gnostics were an early Christian heretical group. They rejected the authority of the bishops. They rejected um, the idea that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ. And St. Ignatius points out, he says, they care nothing for love. They neglect the orphans, the widows, and the oppressed among them. And then he criticizes them for denying the resurrection and the incarnation, denying the sacraments, and denying the authority of the bishop. He says, but you, and this is the earliest use of the phrase the Catholic Church that we know of. He says, you, where the bishop is present, let the people gather, just as where Jesus Christ is, there's the Catholic Church. So in context, he's actually connecting all of these things. He's not just talking about the universality of the church with the word Catholic. In Greek, it's katoliki, and it's a compound. It means through the whole. It's that church that cares for the whole person, for the whole world. You can find it everywhere. And it doesn't just talk about, the enlightened knowledge you need for salvation. That's Gnosticism. It talks about a faith that acknowledges the goodness and the reality of material things, whether it's the incarnation and resurrection of Christ, whether it's the grace of God in the sacraments, or care for the poor and the needy among you. And I think that's a really important kind of Christologically grounded solidarity to help us sort through how do we care for those in need among us without just sliding into a sort of church as, NGO or social justice activist hub or something like that. Sometimes there's a time for those things, but first and foremost, the church's job is to be a witness to the gospel of Christ, and everything we do needs to be grounded in that. And for Ignatius, it was, and it's something that comes up again and again in Orthodox church history, whether it's the Byzantine Symphonia between civil law and canon law, or whether it's that idea of Sobornos that some of those more modern Russian Orthodox writers uncovered in their time. And they literally got it from the word in the creed for Catholic in Old Slavonic. So they really are kind of consistently hitting on the same topic and expanding on it. So I'd say those two things, our perspective on the law and the gospel, and this principle of Catholicity.
Dylan, do you have a copy of your book within reach?
Oh, I don't. Do I have a little cover? I don't. I can send you a picture if you want to edit in a picture. Um, but actually, I could send you a book as well. If you want, I can connect you with Ancient Faith's publicist. We can send you a review copy. But yeah, it would be nice to hold it up. I know. Its problem is I gave away all mine. So
Big problem to have. Dylan Pahman,
yeah.
author of The Kingdom of God and the Common Good Orthodox Christian Social Thought. Thank you very much for this informative conversation.
Thank you, Mark.